Okay, on to comparative advantage in trade, and I hope everybody has their thinking caps on, because this can be, it's not exactly intuitive, so you got to kind of think about it, all right? So, as a simplified example, let's assume that you and your neighbor each have a limited amount of time to either pick apples or cherries, okay? So we can kind of divide it like this, and if you spend your whole day picking apples, you can pick 20 pounds of apples, but no cherries. If you spend your whole day picking cherries, you can pick 20 pounds of cherries. Cherries, but no apples, okay? So those are the two extremes, or some combination in between. Your neighbor, on the other hand, if they spent all day on apples, they could pick 30 pounds. If they spent all day on cherries, they could pick 60 pounds, okay? So that's where we start. If we were going to draw these in production possibilities frontier, here's you, and you could do 20 apples or 20 cherries or some point in between. Your neighbor could do 30 pounds of apples I'm just saying it's a day, 60 pounds of cherries in a day, or some combination in between. So this shows you the maximum, and it also shows you, the trade-offs that we have there. Now, what if you and your neighbor decide to specialize, which means you each focus on one thing, and then you trade? So could your neighbor benefit from this? We can see that she can pick more apples and more cherries than we can in a day. So is there any point for her in trading? And you can see where this would go with countries as well. So let's say they're not trading, okay? And you pick some point in the middle, point here. And so you're picking 8 pounds of apples and 12 pounds of cherries. Your neighbor is picking 9 pounds of apples and 42 pounds of cherries, okay? Just pick this arbitrary kind of point in here because that's what they do. So now we want to say, what if they specialize in trade? Okay, so right now your total production here is the 8 plus the 12, and her total production is the 9 plus the 42, okay? If you specialized, you would go up here, let's say you produce apples, and your neighbor does the cherries. So now you're going to produce 20 pounds of apples, and they're going to produce 60 pounds of cherries. So you can see that the total production is up. Before we had 9 plus 8, we had 17 pounds of apples between the two of us, and 54 pounds of cherries between the two of us, if we take the 12 and the 42. So now you can see if we specialize, we have between the two of us, we have more apples and more cherries. But how does that get kind of traded, okay? So we can see that the total's bigger. Before trade, I was at the 8 and 12, and she was at the 9 and 42. And now with trade, this is production, okay? Before I was producing what I was consuming, and so was she, okay? Now I'm going to produce 20 apples, but I don't want to eat 20 apples, so I'm going to trade 10 pounds of my apples in exchange for 15 pounds of her cherries, okay? So I'm going to take this 20 pounds, I'm going to trade 10 of them to her, and I'm going to keep the other 10, okay? So there's how that 20 goes. Sorry, that's not helpful. Now she's going to take her 60 pounds of cherries, and she's going to trade 15 of them to me, okay? And that leaves 45 left for her. So now if we compare, so this is what I can consume, right? Because I kept some and I traded the other one. So this is what I have to consume. I had 8, now I have 10. So I gained 2 pounds of apples. Before I had 12 pounds of cherries, and now I have 15, so I gained 3. So I gained both apples and cherries. She used to have 9 pounds of apples, now she has 10, so she gained. She had 42 pounds of cherries, now she has 45, so she gained 3. So we both now have more apples and more cherries than we had before, okay? And in this case, I'm a little bit better off, right? I gained 5 pounds of fruit and she gained 4 pounds of fruit, but it's pretty close. When we take this to countries, this becomes important because we can see that the production is clearly more when we're both specializing, but the gains aren't always going to be split evenly. Okay, so let's say this is the gains from trade. The total gains from trade is I don't know, $1,000. Okay, here's country A and here's country B. So let's say the benefit from trade is $1,000 or 1,000 pounds of fruit or whatever. And it would be nice if it was split equally. You get 500 and you get 500, okay? It's usually not, because if the demand for apples or cherries is greater, or or even just a lot of it is the demand for something. What if one country is producing oil, which is really important, and another country is producing rice, which could be produced almost anywhere, whereas oil is highly valued and limited in production. So then it might look like this, okay? So maybe country A gets to benefit 900 and country B only gets to benefit 100. So of that 1,000, country B just got a tiny part and country A got most of the benefit of that trade. Would it make sense for country B to engage in that transaction? And a lot of people would say no, because that's not fair. They're not getting as much. But the answer is yes. They are still 100 better off than they were before. If I said to you, I'm willing to give you $100, you're not going to say, no, give me 900 or nothing. You would say, yeah, I'll take the $100. I would prefer to have 900, but 100's better than nothing, and so I'll take it. And so a country's not going to engage in trade if it somehow makes them worse off. But even if they are not benefiting as much as the other country, they're still benefiting. And so it still makes sense. They're still better off than they were before. You still have $100 more than you did before. So it would be foolish to say, no, I'm not going to do it. So that's the part of trade that I think a lot of people don't understand. Now let's talk about this neighbor here. We said before she could produce more apples and more cherries than I can, but yet she's still better off with the trade, even though I was less efficient in both things. So it has to do with, there's two types of advantage. Absolute advantage means that you can produce it at a lower cost or with less resources. So this could be because of technology or capital and machinery and that kind of stuff, but I can produce more in a day than you can. Comparative advantage, however, means you have the lower, so this means you can produce more or you can produce it faster or whatever. So our neighbor had an absolute advantage in both apples and cherries. She could pick more apples in a day than I could. She could produce more cherries in a day than I could. So she had the absolute advantage in both. But trade is based on comparative advantage, which is the lower opportunity cost. So you can produce more, but we saw in that production possibilities frontier, you're still limited, right? So the more apples you pick, the less time you have for picking cherries. The more cherries you pick, the less time you have for picking apples. So you're still confined by that scarce resource. In this case, it's time. And so in order to do more of one, you have to give something up. So who's giving up the least in order to do that? That's what comparative advantage tells us. And that's what trade is based on. Not absolute advantage. Trade is based on comparative advantage. And that's really important to pick out. So if we look at it this way, here's apples and here's cherries. In order for me, if I wanted to pick 1 more pound of apples, and if we go back to this beginning one, where was it? Here, all right? In order for me to pick 20 pounds, so if I want to, it's 20 and 20. So if I want to pick 1 more pound of cherries, I have to give up 1 pound of apples. If I want to pick more apples, I give up 1 pound of cherries. It's a 20 to 20 thing. So the opportunity cost of apples is calculated as how many cherries you got and how many apples you had to give up. So in this case, in order to get 20 cherries, I had to give up 20 apples, so the opportunity cost is 1. If I want to look at that for my neighbor, though, if I do, in order to get 60 cherries, 60 pounds of cherries, she had to give up 30 pounds of apples, so her opportunity cost is 2. Every pound of cherries cost her 2 apples, okay? Every pound of apples cost her 2 cherries, okay? Cherries over apples. The opportunity cost of cherries, here, I'll change colors because I can't write on the bottom very well. Here, we'll make it red. The opportunity cost of cherries, oops, is then how many apples you had to give up to get the cherries, all right? So again, here it's 20. To get 20 apples, I had to give up 20 cherries. That's 1. And here I do apples over cherries. So that's 30 over 60. So in order to get 1 pound of cherries, I only had to give up a half a pound of apples. Or the neighbor did, sorry, not me. So this is how you calculate opportunity cost. In order to get 1 more pound of cherries, she had to give up a half a pound of apples. In order to get 1 more pound of apples, she had to give up 2 pounds of cherries. So in order to figure out who has the comparative advantage and where the trade should be, you need to calculate the opportunity cost, and that's what we have right here. So I'm a 1-to-1 thing, but her opportunity cost of apples is 2 pounds of cherries. Her opportunity cost of cherries is a half pound of apples, okay? So if we look at who has the lower opportunity cost in apples, 1 is smaller than 2. So I have the comparative advantage in apples. When we look at cherries, in order to produce a pound of cherries, I had to give up 1 pound of apples. She only had to give up a half a pound of apples. So the neighbor has the comparative advantage in cherries. So again, this is talking about comparative advantage is for trade. So opportunity cost, not the absolute advantage, okay? So this says she should produce cherries, I should produce apples, and then we trade. And that's what we saw in this one, right? She's going to produce the cherries, I'm going to produce the apples, and we're going to trade. And obviously the trade could work out different ways, but that's how we figure out who's going to produce what, and then obviously there'd be some politics involved with the how that's going to benefit, you know, depending on a lot of different things. But ultimately, we're both going to be better off if we focus where we have the comparative advantage, or where we have the lowest opportunity cost. So that's comparative advantage. If that doesn't make sense, maybe go through it again slowly. Look at the homework. Look at the study plan, and we're going to do one of these in our Zoom session this week, 1 or 2 of these, just to make sure everybody got it, because it takes a little getting used to for this one.